Imagine waking up in a world without walls, without a roof, without any light. Besides a fire that does not exist yet, the air is hot and heavy, filled with the smell of wet earth and dry grass. You have no clothes, no metal weapons, nothing at all beyond your own body and the intelligence that is just beginning to awaken inside it. We are talking about 2 million years ago, a time so distant that it is almost impossible for the modern human mind to grasp. But it was exactly at this moment, somewhere in the African savannah, that the story which would eventually lead to you began to be written. Before we continue this journey, if you enjoy traveling through time and discovering how our ancestors lived, subscribe to the channel now. It helps our work tremendously, and make sure you do not miss the next episodes of this incredible series about the origin of humanity. 2 million years ago, the planet was unrecognizable. The continents were already almost in the position we know today, but wildlife was completely different. There were no cities, no roads, absolutely no sign of civilization. There was only nature, in its rawest and most relentless form. And in the middle of that nature, a group of beings was starting to stand out from all the other animals. The first representatives of the genus Homo. Creatures that were not yet human like us, but were also no longer just another ordinary primate. Subscribing to the channel now is the best way to support this work of historical reconstruction we do here, showing what life would really have been like before writing, before agriculture, before anything we recognize as modern culture. The main setting of this story is East Africa, a region that today corresponds to countries like Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia. There, in valleys and open savannas, small groups of hominins lived, most likely Homo habilis, and a bit later in this period, Homo erectus, a species that would bring revolutionary changes to the way our ancestors related to the world. These beings stood about 5 feet tall, had bodies more robust than ours, and a brain that, although smaller than the modern human brain, was already significantly larger than that of other primates of the time. Life began as soon as the sun rose. There were no alarm clocks, no watches, but the primitive human body was already perfectly synchronized with the natural cycles of light and darkness. At dawn, the group would start moving. The number one priority, every single day without exception, was finding food. There was no refrigerator, no pantry, no way at all to store food for long periods. Every day was a new hunt for survival. Keep watching until the end, because in a moment I will show you how these first humans managed to survive in a world full of predators far stronger than they were. And do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly makes all the difference in keeping this content being produced. The diet of these early hominins was extremely varied and opportunistic. They ate fruits, roots, seeds, leaves, insects, bird eggs, and, whenever possible, meat. But it is important to understand one thing. Most of the time, these beings were not the great hunters we imagine from movies. They were, above all, scavengers. This means that a large part of the meat they consumed came from animals that had already been killed by other predators, such as lions and hyenas. Early humans would watch the sky looking for circling vultures, a clear sign that there was a dead body somewhere below. Upon finding a carcass, they had to act quickly, often competing directly with other animals to get a piece of that meat before it was too late. It was exactly in this context that one of the greatest inventions in human history began to take shape. Stone tools. Archaeologists have found at sites such as Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania thousands of chipped stone tools belonging to this period. They are known as Oldowan tools, named precisely after that location. These were simple objects made by striking one stone against another until a sharp edge was formed. But this simplicity hides a silent revolution. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, an animal was deliberately modifying its surrounding environment to create an extension of its own body. These stone flakes allowed our ancestors to cut through the thick hide of dead animals, something human teeth and nails could never accomplish on their own. With these tools, our ancestors were able to access meat and the bone marrow hidden inside bones, an extremely valuable source of fat and calories for brain development. And speaking of the brain, this is one of the most fascinating points in this story. A diet rich in fat and protein, obtained through access to meat and marrow, is believed to have been one of the key factors allowing the brain of these hominins to grow over generations. A larger brain consumes far more energy than a body of the same size, and without this extra source of calories, it is possible that the evolution of our intelligence would have followed a completely different path, or might not have happened the way we know it at all. The social life of these first human groups also already showed signs of complexity. They lived in small bands, likely made up of a few dozen individuals, bound together by kinship ties. There was not yet a structured language like ours, with complex grammar and syntax. But there was certainly already communication. Gestures, facial expressions, different vocal sounds to warn of danger, to draw attention, to express emotions. This primitive communication was essential for the survival of the group, because a lone individual in the African savanna 2 million years ago had very little chance of surviving for long, and the dangers were constant. Imagine living in a world where cave lions, giant hyenas, and other large predators saw you not as the top of the food chain, but as a potential prey item.
Unlike us today,
who sit firmly at the top, these early humans occupied a much more fragile position in the ecosystem. They needed to stay constantly alert, seek shelter in trees or rock formations at night, and move as a group to reduce the risk of attacks. If you are enjoying this reconstruction of ancestral life, leave a comment below telling me what has impressed you the most so far. I read every comment, and it helps me understand which topics you want to see in the next videos of this series about human evolution. Water was also a central issue in daily life. Groups needed to live relatively close to rivers, lakes, or swamps, because dehydration in a tropical African climate could kill within just a few days. But living near water also meant living near crocodiles, hippopotamuses, and other extremely dangerous animals that frequented these areas. Each trip to the riverbank to drink water was, in a way, a small act of courage, carefully calculated by the most experienced members of the group. Children of this era grew up in a way very different from what we know today. There was no school, no books, absolutely no form of formal education. Everything a child needed to learn came from directly observing adults and from constant practice, learning to recognize which fruits were safe to eat, which were poisonous, how to identify the tracks of dangerous animals, how to chip a stone to create a cutting tool. This process of learning by imitation, which we still see today in remaining hunter-gatherer societies, was the only way to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. The climate 2 million years ago was also not static. Africa went through cycles of significant climate change, alternating between wetter periods with denser forests and drier periods with open savannas expanding. These climate shifts likely placed enormous evolutionary pressure on these early hominins, favoring those who could adapt to increasingly open and unpredictable environments. It was exactly within this context of environmental instability that traits such as the ability to walk long distances on 2 legs, the famous bipedalism, became a decisive evolutionary advantage. Walking on 2 legs, something we do today without even thinking about it, was actually one of the most important adaptations in the entire human lineage. It freed the hands to carry objects, to handle tools, to carry offspring and food at the same time. In addition, bipedalism is a far more energy-efficient form of locomotion over long distances than moving on 4 limbs, which allowed these early humans to cover much larger areas in search of resources. At this point in our timeline, Homo erectus begins to stand out as one of the most successful species of the genus Homo. Unlike earlier species, Homo erectus had a body much more similar to ours, with long legs and body proportions adapted for walking and running long distances. Some scientists also credit this species as the first to control fire, although the strongest evidence for controlled fire use points to a somewhat later period. Either way, Homo erectus represents a massive evolutionary leap, being the first human species to leave the African continent and spread into parts of Asia. Returning to daily life, it is important to point out that nighttime was, without a doubt, the most dangerous part of the day. Without controlled fire during this specific period, or with only very limited control over it, darkness brought a constant risk of attacks from nocturnal predators. Groups likely sought shelter in elevated locations, caves, or among rock formations that offered some natural protection. Sleep, in this context, was not the peaceful rest we know today, but rather a period of constant vigilance, with group members possibly taking turns watching the surroundings for any sign of danger. Death, during this period, was a constant and close companion. Life expectancy was extremely low compared to modern standards, and many individuals did not survive past their 20s or 30s. Diseases, infections, injuries from animal attacks, falls, childbirth complications, all of this contributed to a life filled with constant risk. Even so, these early humans managed not only to survive, but to thrive enough to leave descendants who, over millions of years, would evolve into the species you represent right now, reading or listening to these words. One of the most fascinating aspects of this era is thinking about the minds of these beings. They had no art, no organized religion as we know it, no written myths or stories passed down through generations by complex speech. But did they feel fear?
Yes.
Almost certainly, yes. Did they feel some kind of affection for their children, their partners, the members of their group? Evidence strongly suggests they did. Comparative studies with modern primates, such as chimpanzees and bonobos, show behaviors of care, affection, and even grief over the death of group members. It is reasonable to imagine that these early representatives of the genus Homo already carried, in some primitive form, the emotional seeds that would later become the foundation of our own humanity. It is also worth pausing for a moment to think about the territory these groups occupied. Contrary to what many people imagine, these early humans did not stay in one single place for very long. In practice, they were nomads. A group might settle in an area near a river for a few weeks, exploring the available resources until food began to run scarce or until conditions became too dangerous. At that point, it was time to gather up the few belongings they had, essentially just the stone tools they carried, and move on in search of a new place that could sustain the group for a while longer. This nomadic lifestyle helps explain why we find traces of these early humans scattered across such a vast area of the African continent, and why, over time, some populations eventually ventured out of Africa, kicking off one of the greatest migration stories in the natural history of the planet. Stone tools also continued to evolve throughout this period. What began as simple flakes and rough points gradually became more refined. Successive generations learned by watching their elders to choose better types of stone, to more precisely calculate the angle of each strike, and to produce more efficient tools for cutting, scraping, and piercing. This slow process of technological improvement, which today might seem insignificant, was in fact the first chapter of a long story of innovation that millions of years later would lead to the wheel, to writing, to electricity, and to the artificial intelligence that, ironically, is now helping to tell this very story to you. Before we move on to the end of this script, remember to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This ensures you receive the next videos in this series as soon as they are published, continuing this incredible journey through human history. Looking back at these 2 million years of distance, it is impossible not to feel a mix of admiration and humility. Admiration for the incredible resilience of these beings who, without any of the technological tools we consider basic today, managed to survive in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. And humility upon realizing that everything we are today, our cities, our technology, our art, our science, all of it has deep roots planted in the African savanna, in bodies that walked on 2 legs, hands that learned to chip stones, and minds that were slowly beginning to awaken to something greater than simple, instinctive survival. These early humans did not know they were writing the first chapter of our story. They had no idea that millions of years in the future, their distant descendants would be building spacecraft, writing symphonies, painting pictures, and telling this very same story through a glowing screen. But every chipped stone, every carcass found, every night survived safely, was a small step in an extraordinary journey that continues to this day. If this video made you reflect on the origins of humanity, leave a comment telling me what you found most surprising about life 2 million years ago. Share this video with someone who is also interested in history and human evolution. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next episodes of this fascinating journey through our species' past. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.